Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. This video, we're going to take a look at how to set up the current P2. You should, before watching this video, have made sure to set up your environment, having completed your P1, and as well as having started on the Fundamentals series. This is part of the Fundamentals series. As a matter of fact, we're actually going to leverage some of what we watch in this video today in the Fundamentals demo. So the first thing you want to do is get a copy of the P2 instructions. And then from there, what you want to do is go ahead and create a new project, new C and C++ project. And then we want to call this one simply enough P2. As far as the main, we want to go ahead and call this one P2 as well. Make sure to select a C as your file extension and then hit finish. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go in and we want to customize or clean up our main. And to do that, we can leverage the template that I've given you earlier. The template just allows for you to speed up this process a little bit, particularly in the file copy, Blazor ID, and so on. So just make sure and overwrite that. And then in this case, what we want to do is we want to refer to this one as our p2.c. I encourage you to try to improve the documentation a little bit. I'm just trying to get you started on this process. The second thing you want to do is to go ahead and copy the documentation for your main. And once again, I encourage you to clean this up as you see fit for a particular project. Now, in this particular example, if you've read through the instructions, you know that basically what we have is we have multiple functions. And we essentially want to have our executable have three different functionalities. One associated with the 1D projectile motion, one associated with 2D projectile motion, and then one associated with a simple beam calculation. We'll get to future versions of these later, but essentially what I've done here in this P2 setup.txt is simply extracted out the function signatures from that larger P2 instructions document. And so what you want to do is you want to go ahead and copy those out basically one by one and put them inside of your P2.c. You want it after the includes, but before the mains. And so these are essentially your function prototypes. Okay, so basically, if you recall from an earlier video, you know that these are your contracts, if you would, of what you plan on doing in your C executable. Now, moving on, what you want to do is each one of these, you want to turn into a function. And so in this case, I'm going to simply copy and paste each one of my function prototypes, and I'm going to turn them into functions by simply adding curly braces. Now, notice on this particular example that not only do we accept no input arguments, in other words, each one of our functions has void for an input argument, but it also has void for an output argument. This simply means that each one of these functions accepts no input and no output. What does that practically mean? Well, that means that any printfs and scanfs that are required to collect information from the user or ultimately print the data back to the user or calculations back to the user needs to be done within the function itself. What you're going to discover is that this is very restrictive and will lead to a lot of redundancy. But essentially, all of your printfs and scanfs will need to reside inside of these individual functions. Now, that's not the purpose of this particular video. The purpose of this video is just to get P2 set up. And to do that, what I want to do is I simply want to put a printf statement inside of each one of our functions, starting with projectile 1D version 1. And you'll see that I am perhaps a little bit simplistic when it comes to this, but I just like to put something in there to begin with. And so I'm going to say calling projectile 1D version 1. And I like to think of this as nothing more than a sanity check. In other words, it tells me that I am, in fact, calling my function. And you can ultimately comment these out later, but I like to keep them in, at least in the beginning when I'm developing. Likewise, we want to put a printf in the second function, changing it, of course, to projectile underscore 2D version 1. And then lastly will be printf calling simple supported beam version 1. Now, for the specifics of the calculation, I've actually provided you a PowerPoint presentation that gives you some slides that shows each of the individual calculations and what I'm looking for. So I'm going to leave that for you to follow up on. But what I instead want to do is I want to focus on the task at hand and the dilemma that you're going to have. And that is that you've got a single executable that you want to call 3 different ways, depending on whether you want the user to see the V1, V2, excuse me, the 1D, the 2D, or the beam implementation. And so to start off with, you simply want to put a call to each one of the functions, starting with projectile 1D version 1. So this calls the 1D version. Projectile 2D version 1 does nothing more than calls the 2D version. And then lastly, the simple supported beam version 1 calls the beam. Now, we're almost done with the setup. We want to go back to our main template, and we want to borrow this template for the name, the description, and the arguments, and we simply want to paste it in front of each one of our functions, or you can type this out manually, that's fine also. And we simply want to include the function name. I like to include the input and output arguments, description of the function. We'll keep this one simple, 1D projectile calculation. Likewise, with the 2D one, we want to do the same thing with the name. The description is going to be 2D projectile calculation. And then lastly, the simple supported beam. And this is just going to be the shear, or the reaction forces. So this is the reaction forces for a simple supported beam. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do in all 3 of these is we want to just simply document the arguments. Well, the beautiful thing about this is that we have both a void input and output, so we don't really have too much to document on this one. This will get more involved as we go along. So for the arguments, we simply just mention that they are void input and output, which means that we have no return values for any of these functions. But that brings us back to our main. Right now, if we were to compile this, and as a matter of fact, let's go ahead and do it. We're going to build it, and I'll just show you. If we then change over, so I'm going to change over multiple directories here. I'm going to change to my P2, go to my distribution, to my debug, and my MinGW. And then if I run my P2, you'll see that technically it calls all 3 of those functions. Well, we probably don't want that to happen. As a matter of fact, if you read the instructions, the idea is that you would create an executable for each of those functions, which leads us to the dilemma. How are we going to do that? Well, the answer is you simply comment out the 2 that you don't want to run, build it, and then rerun the executable. And you'll see that it only calls, in this case, 1D version 1. Likewise, what you would do is you would simply comment this one out, build it, but now if you think about it, when you compiled it, you ended up essentially overriding the old P2. And so if you follow the instructions, the idea was that you would have a separate executable for each one of the functions. In order to accomplish that, what you want to do is you want to compile it first with the first function uncommented and the other two commented, then rename it as I've specified in the document, then go back to the source file, comment out the first one, and then uncomment out the second one, recompile it, rename P2 to what I've specified in the document, and so on. Now, part of this exercise is for you to actually appreciate how much of a waste of time it actually is. So I'm limiting you to only 3 functions. Now, the functions themselves are not a waste of time. We're actually going to use those later on, but the process by which we are doing this. So we've got to find a better way, but just go ahead and go through the steps for this particular project. This is focused more on writing these individual functions and then just simply turning them on and off in main. Once again, hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me. And thank you for watching.